In this video, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show you how to get your track sounding from this to this absolute loudness like this. But the concept of this video isn't to introduce any distortion or whatsoever. We are going to use one of the loudest limiters I worked with, which is the Cedar Audio Adapter Limiter 2. But this time we'll be also monitoring the loudness using this free plugin called the Ulin Loudness Meter. So the mix you're about to hear is mastered and I just removed the limiter. So let's monitor that loudness and then we'll be monitoring the loudness after using the limiter at the end of the video. As I mentioned, the goal for today is to get the track as loud as possible. But of course, in a way, it sounds beautiful. The thing you have to understand about limiters that you have to pick carefully which limiter are you going to use. Because each of them sounds different and will offer different loudness. This is the reason I'm using Adaptive Limiter 2. Now this is an adaptive limiter, so there is a big difference between this one. Because a conventional limiter controls the loudness by observing the peak amplitude. And it works on a user-determined threshold. Now, Adaptive Limiter 2 works a bit different, because this kind of limiter uses a unique algorithm that calculates a continually varying EQ profile that constrains the amplitude of the output while retaining the integrity of the input signal, which means that as loud as you push this limiter, your signal will remain clean, which is the most important thing when it comes to mastering. So now this limiter looks actually very simple because you have a few controls here. You have the threshold, which you obviously know what it does. You have a ceiling, so you can set the output after limiting. You have the spectrum control and you have two temporal controls. Now, threshold and ceiling are very common controls and I believe you know what they do. But the spectral and the temporal controls for the low and the high frequencies are a bit unfamiliar, and if you're struggling with this, if you own this limiter, let me explain how to set them up. So the spectral control, what it does, it determines the degree by which the profile can change from one frequency to the next. So, for example, if you set this to a very low setting, such as this one, you'll be triggering more of that conventional and that old school limiting like you're used to. However, switching this to a bit positive value, such as this, you're triggering this adaptive effect and the power of this specific limiter. But now when it comes to temporal controls for the low and the high frequencies, imagine like you can control the response on the low and the high frequencies and how they affect and how they'll be sounding after using this limiter. So these temporal controls basically determine the rate at which the profile is permitted to change at very low frequencies and very high frequencies. So for example, if you want the traditional limiting, and I'll be comparing how that sounds compared to the adaptive limiting, you'll be setting these controls to negative, or maybe keeping this at 0 or even negative like this, and you'll be monitoring what happened here. So this would be more of that conventional way of limiting, which sounds loud, sounds okay, but adaptive limiter to me sounds more clean and much louder. And also if you experiment with this limiter, or if you read the manual, which I highly suggest for any tool you use, by setting these to higher values, such as this one, you'll be basically maximizing the loudness of this limiter and what this specific plugin can do. And the results is simply amazing. So now I'll be jumping into some demos. So first of all, let's do the demo with conventional style. So I'll be switching these values to the negative and you can see how it does. We'll keep the threshold and the ceiling the same and we'll be comparing what happens there. Notice the character, notice the sound, notice the loudness. These are the differences you want to monitor. So I guess you now like the results and now you understand how this specific limiter works. The key here is to avoid pushing this kind or any other limiter way too hard. Of course, you won't like the effect. Even though you cannot distort using this limiter, I advise keeping the settings subtle and then try and dial in the threshold and also the ceiling to match the specific loudness and the specific effect you're looking on your track. As you can see, when I switched to that traditional style of limiting, the loudness was a bit lower, the signal remained clean, but still there are some artifacts and I noticed the loss in the low end. However, when I switched to adaptive limiting, kept the positive value, the spectral and the temporal controls, the loudness became much greater, and you can also notice how adaptive limiter basically flows through the track and keeps the track clean and super loud, which is the effect we all like. Thank you for watching the video and thank you also for checking out the adaptive limiter tool. This is the tool I personally really like and it works perfectly for me. Write me down in the comments if you want me to review any specific plugins and I hope to see you in a new video.